And hopefully from that point, we'll start talking about that adoption, get it done.
Good.
Last Thursday, we did a meeting with the Downtown Design Review Board, just to talk to them about the new architectural standards, specifically the ones that will be applying to downtown, which gives them a little bit more teeth, a little bit more things to react to. We had a lot of discussions, I would say, about signage in downtown. And I think they were generally on board with where we were going. We had talked about specifically the discussion, permanent sign-wise, was on projecting signs, which you technically don't allow now, even though you have some. And they were all on board with allowing them. So that's going to be a variation. We'll also try to incorporate some reasonable, we had a discussion about color and related to temporary signs and everything like that. I think we'll get a little bit more into that because there were some examples where colors weren't a great fit when it was the permanent signage, but were a little bit more tolerable if it was like temporary signage getting them to the permanent sign, I think was essentially the end result there. But that's part of what we're going to be talking about here today, because we ended our discussions before we got into temporary signs. So I'm going to preface this, and unfortunately Marvin's not here, so I still need to have a call with him to make sure he's very good with all of this. But several times during this process, I've told you that signs have become a nightmare for pretty much every community because of the Supreme Court. And we have to avoid regulating based on the content of the sign, which means we shouldn't have to read the sign to determine how to regulate it. So a real estate sign, you only know it's a real estate sign if you read it. A contractor sign, you only know, that kind of thing.
Oh.
Huh?
I was talking real estate signs. Boo! We have a real
Grand opening, developer, all of them, right? So we have to get away from that, and we have to focus on the type. So temporary yard signs, temporary banner signs, that kind of thing. However, we're in a tricky kind of gray area because that court case that made everybody's problematic did not necessarily speak to, overturn, or exactly tell us how to deal with previous court cases that allowed a city like New Philadelphia to have certain regulations for commercial signs versus non-commercial, and not go further. So a non-commercial sign is political, a religious opinion, anything without a commercial activity, business, anything like that. And obviously commercial is, now hiring, real estate, developer. You don't take it any further, you don't get any more definitive. So there's a gray area. We don't know if the city can do that. If before this 2015 case, you could, as long as you were more hands-off on the non-commercial stuff. So a lot of communities just said, listen, temporary non-commercial signs, keep them out of the right-of-way, no bigger than X square feet, no taller than this type of sign, and they just otherwise stayed hands-off. And then commercial signs, in a residential lot, maybe you could have two small temporary yard signs. So at any one time, you could have a real estate sign or a garage sale sign or, a community event sign, any of those things. You could have them with maintenance things. So you could be more restrictive on commercial. And here's where I'm going to have I gave you two examples of the way communities have done it. And I'll explain why, because there's some administrative and enforcement issues to be dealt with depending on which way you go. So I have shown you two ways that communities done it. One has a slight risk because we don't know where the courts are going to fall on it. The other one is much more defensible because it has no content. But as I'll explain, there's some enforcement issues with it, and trying to figure out, okay, well, how much signage do you allow? I'm just giving you a heads up. There is no perfect solution. If I knew it, I'd be just making all kinds of money going around fixing everybody's sign code, or there would be a perfect model. But I do this all the time. I have worked with so many attorneys, and it's just no great solution. Everything has a little bit of a risk, and it's just going to be a question of how far do you take that risk. So That is my disclaimer before we get into this fun one. So the first section that we have here is actually a pretty basic line standard. There's nothing controversial in here. It's just like, you know, the basic rules for any temporary sign. So they can't be illuminated, you know, so you can't be spotlighting them or that type of thing. They can't be, actually number 6 here, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit because it might be easier to read. Number 6 is a good example one where we had a very specific conversation with the Downtown Design Review Board. So temporary signs shall not be fixed to any permanent sign or structure except when a banner sign is permitted to cover a permanent sign. And actually any banner sign can be attached to a permit. The point of this is there's a lot of examples out there, and I think you've had a couple. I think, Joshua, you had mentioned one that was covered by like a tent canvas cover or fabric or something. There's a lot of examples where somebody goes out of business and they just put essentially the equivalent of a trash bag or something over it to cover it. We don't want to allow that, but there are a lot of good examples of where, example, a new business is coming into a pre-existing building, and there might be an existing wall sign or an existing freestanding sign where, in order to get their business up and running, they don't have time to get their new signs in. And so we allow for, us, in this case, in this draft, 60 days to put a banner sign over a previous one so you can, like, essentially a turnkey business get going. In talking with the Downtown Design Review, they actually didn't think that 60 days was enough, and the 60 days is later on, but that 60 days was enough, in part because a lot of the smaller businesses, you know, are spending a lot of their money up front in just getting their businesses started, and the signs, while important, are not critical to get right, you know, up front. And actually, if you give them a little bit more time, they might be able to think of a more creative approach to permanent signage without wasting a lot of money up front. So they had suggested that we extend it to allow for, if there is a pre-existing sign, that you can have a temporary banner that would cover it for up to a year. So that is a difference between what you have seen and what we have talked about. So that was actually a pretty lengthy discussion, because there are a lot of examples, especially downtown right now, where somebody's got a banner sign and they're just new businesses. And so that's kind of what led to it. So I'm interested to hear what the Greater Planning Commission here has to, their thoughts on it.
And you explained it very well. That was a great conversation we had with that, and Dave on that, and actually the mayor and I. And the 60-day, we just thought, you know, you're up and coming with a business, and then try to strap them with, especially if they want to get creative with some of the stuff Dawson does out of Strasburg, which is a sign that's going to cost, you know, $5,000, $10,000. So we thought that 60 days just needed to be extended some because of that, just for that reason alone. And to put that burden, we all know the statistics on a business lasting a year, 5 years, it's you know, we don't want to cut into that. So going with that, covering with that, we're trying to just help that new business try to stay there, but we don't want to just let them have it for forever either.
Yeah.
But floor's open to you guys if you guys think it's
thoughts. Share your thoughts.
But that was our thought process through that.
And we do have a maintenance requirement. It will be tied to the property maintenance code. So obviously, if they put it up and it gets tattered or something, they would have to replace it at that point,
Yes.
permanent or otherwise. That doesn't restart the time frame. But you know, it's the same with any temporary signs. There is a maintenance requirement. So we're not here to, you know, just allow anything anywhere until it falls apart.
I think what Josh was running into is, and I think we've all seen them, and it's the easy thing, they'll just put a tarp over it. So you gotta get away from them tarps, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're flapping in the wind. We've all seen the couple that we have that had tracked that, so we're trying to get it away from that also.
What is your definition of you're saying temporary would be a banner, but a lot of signs today that we put up are coroplast, and it's a lasting material, but it's not really a long-term material, but Are we splitting hairs by bringing that up?
So when we are talking about the materials in this specific case, it's for the banners that are covering permanent signs or something temporarily, not for like other, so a typical banner is a vinyl material that would be allowed. I think the issue Joshua brought up was, I think it was like a canvas fabric. It was not a traditional sign.
Right.
With yard signs, we don't actually specify the material, so
Right.
it could be your core, it could be, you know, any, you know, some of it times it is plastic over the little thing, so it could be any of those. Some realtors have more of a metallic sign.
Right.
We're not regulating the materials of that. This is just a material for like signs that are covering permanent signs
Right.
for a
Well,
certain
that
amount.
was my point, the permanent signs, doesn't matter, if we're talking about automobile, and a permanent sign, you can put an inexpensive coroplast sign up and it looks good, and it'll last 3 or 4 years probably.
Yeah, we don't, yeah, we're not, yeah, we don't get into the materials of the
Okay.
permanent signs.
That's my
yeah.
point, yeah.
Now, what are you thinking though? Ron, you were saying, okay, 60 days, you think something extended further than that, but how far, how much
We
longer?
did it for a year.
Okay.
Up to a year.
And the specific, again, the specific reasoning behind that wasn't, it wasn't a magical discussion, but part of it was really just thinking about some of the businesses that are getting started here. You're not talking about the franchisees who've got a lot of money behind them. You're
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about
Mom and pop
individuals. Yeah.
Style business.
That are trying to get started and their priority is keeping that business going, and the sign's important, but not the priority.
Totally, yeah. The operation inside is probably the bigger thing, but yeah.
What about 6 months? So the thought with the year was they're either gonna fail or succeed within a year, right?
It was that, but it was also that gives them a little bit of time to see how their temporary, because I think the thought behind it was that the temporary sign is also serving as a little bit of to see if if whatever the current, the banner, the cheap banner sign, and by cheap I mean it's cheaper than a permanent, is creating the visibility they want versus if they need to tweak it, then hey, we can try a different one, you know,
Oh.
that kind of thing. It's not, so it's a little bit about, yeah, it is unfortunately a little bit about seeing if they can be successful and not forcing them to put a lot of money into a sign as part of that loss, but also it's part of learning, especially the mom and pops who may not have a lot of money to go to a sign designer and be like, what do you think? You know, that they can kind of see how that visibility works over a year. I forget what was it, the shop we were talking
So
about?
boho, if you look at theirs, they
Yes, that's
changed
the one
what
I was
they
thinking.
started
Thank you.
with, so it gave them a chance for the artistic part of it too, they changed that initial sign, so if you go out and jump them at 60 days or 6 months, you didn't give them a chance to brand
Themselves.
what they actually wanna change, so they can't make that decision on this is gonna be it, you know, like again, Starbucks is Starbucks, you know, they got it, they're
Their
doing
brand's
it.
already been
This
built.
new place, they just don't know what that brand looks like.
But what after 11 months they decided, well, this is not working, so we're gonna tweak it? Is that another year from that point?
No, it's, you get 1
No,
year.
it's 1
So
year.
1
it's-
year.
No.
The one thing I had mentioned is this 1 year exception is for new businesses, and part of it is that you have to go, if you're gonna change like occupancy, which is what would happen, we're actually requiring, if you remember long ago, our discussions is we will require like a review, a zoning compliance review permit, because part of that is checking where the new businesses are for taxes and all that kind of stuff. It will be triggered by that application. So once you go in and get your new business, you can say, I'm gonna do a banner sign, you get 1 year from that date. So if you go at 11 months and change it, that's fine, but you get 1 more month.
Yeah.
So whether or not they wanna just use that 1 month to get a permanent sign, whether they wanna change out and play around with that, you get 1 month, or 1 year, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, your question about whether 6 months, I had 60 days because that's what other communities want to do. The Downtown Design Review had suggested 1 year. You could see, you know, it's all, this is where the policy is up to you.
Is there some sort of, I don't know, some sort of like, let's say you got 12 months to do something,
Yeah.
but some sort of, to show some sort of improvement? That show that something's been done or being thought of, so it's not just, you know, bleeding out the town, I guess, you know what I mean, from
Yeah.
something that doesn't look great or whatever, just to hold them accountable to some extent.
What?
I think the question then becomes, and I'm not trying to, I'm just playing devil's out. I think
Yeah.
the problem is, or the question there is, you know, who's gonna judge that? That's a very discretionary thing of,
Yeah.
are you improving it? So are you gonna make them come in?
I guess
and-
anything.
In 6 months and do a review in front of a board or go to the Board of Zoning Appeals?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know, I think from Joshua's standpoint, that's another step that he would have to be, you know, checking the
Involved in,
thing, yeah, so.
right.
But there's still they still have to maintain it,
Yeah,
as far as that goes, they still have to,
if it fades, if it's, you
But I
know.
guess in their case, it's just something hanging, it's a tarp, right? It's,
Well, and it has to be secured in
Yeah.
in a particular manner, you know. The other thing, you know, again, getting back to materials, there's certain materials, actually one of the newer materials, I don't even call it newer, because it's been around now for about 8, maybe 10 years, is, you know, almost like the vinyl, it's like the vinyl that you see, they heat to a car,
Right here, yeah.
and they can do that with signage now. So it'll look like it's painted on
Sell it.
temporarily, but they can just pull it off
Yeah.
in a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's all kinds of, you know, kind of wild and crazy materials out there. So not all of it, we're not specifically saying manners. I think in the So Boho, in fact, there isn't technically a pre-existing sign behind it, but they are using a temporary sign for the time being.
Yeah, I guess that's, you know, I agree with that 60 days is very, you know, very little to work with, and I can understand from a startup standpoint, your resources is building, you know, the inside out, right? And, so yeah, I guess go with a year, and I guess we'll see how that goes. I don't know how many, you know, new startups we have, you know, to go off of and look at, but I do recognize the Soboho one, so.
Okay. So we'll go with that for now. I mean, again, this is one of those things, there are gonna be so many changes in this code that at some point you're just gonna have to be monitoring to see how it goes. But there are gonna also be, a lot of times that is I also see that as being like a long-term, not everybody's gonna capitalize on 1 year, because for the most part, if they feel like they're being successful, they're gonna wanna like have that nice permanent sign. So a lot of people are gonna move forward faster than a year, but it gives them time to be flexible.
I'd have been more hesitant to give them that extra 10 months if we did not have that maintenance piece in there.
yeah.
You know what I mean? That would have been, you know, I don't wanna look at it, you know, I'd have stuck with 60 days or something like that because of that. But with the maintenance factor in there that they have to maintain it anyway, I felt better with a year, that's just me.
Well, and again, and we'll get into this, but when we get to, we start into getting into, the temporary signs, and the thing we have to do, because we can't read content, is, you know, real estate signs can be up for hopefully 1 week, but sometimes they can be up for a very long time, you know, a year or two, depending on, you know, what it may be.
Right.
So, you know, and the same with, you know, any form of sign. Political signs are not just about the elections. You know, so all of those signs, while temporary in design, meaning they don't have a foundation, no building, you know, that kind of thing, they are all going to be subject to maintenance requirements. So nobody can just go stick a sign out there and forget about it. They are all going to be held to maintenance requirements. So that is the one benefit you have there. Okay. One of the things I have here on number 12 is I've said temporary signs should not be located in the right-of-way. Where the right-of-way is unknown, the temporary sign should be set back a minimum 10 feet from the edge of any street pavement. So right now, you know, you really don't allow for any signs, and we're fixing some of that in the right-of-way, so the projecting signs go in the right-of-way. But when it comes to temporary signs, it's always a fun one because everybody is usually just putting it out there in front of their front yard, and they don't necessarily know that, oh, it's the back of the sidewalk or back of a ditch, or sometimes it's unknown. And so this has been a kind of a requirement that some communities prefer to at least make it pretty easy to be like, as long as you're kind of 10 feet back, okay, it's pretty well known that you are, you know, outside of, or at least close enough to be outside of the right of way, rather than, you know, fighting the people that are, like, who legitimately just don't know.
Utility poles are typically set behind the right of way, so,
Sometimes, yeah.
yeah.
Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they're in an easement, and we have the rules that they can't be on utility lines without, you know, or utility poles or anything like that. Just like they can't be put on trees, we're not allowing them to be mounted on trees and that type of thing. So. All right, so I told you, and again, I'm not gonna have you commit to any of these because we need to get Marvin to give us the thumbs up, and I will call him this week. But I'm giving you two of the most common options that communities have tried to deal with in this content-neutral world. The first one is the solid content-neutral one. We're not getting into if it's commercial or non-commercial. We're just not going to touch what that is. What this does is this forces you to say, we got to allow a certain number and a certain amount at any one time. Because we can't say it's political versus commercial versus whatever. What amount is reasonable hasn't been determined by the courts. We know we can't just say, well, you can only have one sign or two signs, because what's going to happen this November is everybody's going to have signs up left, right, and the other, right? So some communities have gone as content neutral as possible. This is where you can see the tricky aspect of this, and set some kind of boundary. So in this case, in a residential district, they would say, we're not going to tell you how many you can have. You can have up to 36 square feet total. None of them can be more than 6 square feet. I have other communities that are like no more than 36 and no bigger than 32. So the plywood, the big signs you see at political things. So you can have one and one small one or any combination. Some communities allow 40 square feet. What the magic number is, again, courts are really good about telling you when you're wrong and not what the right answer is. So this is just one approach to it. Here's the thing. You can't, beyond this, you can't go any further. Here, and I think you probably can see the tricky part of this is what's going to happen at the controversial political elections like this November. No matter what number we put up there, there's going to be a lot of people who go above it. And while you're not supposed to do it, there's going to be a lot of, I don't see the problem, like just blinders on from enforcement. So no matter what the number is, you're kind of going in knowing that at certain points, if nobody's complaining, you're ignoring the issue. That's unfortunately where cities are. And then with the commercial stuff, we allow a certain amount for, like in commercial districts, we would allow a certain amount of unrestricted time. So they could do, if they wanted to have a tenant, like in a commercial place, a tenant, landlord sign or for lease sign up, they could do that year round, keep it maintained, you're fine. And then a certain number of days per quarter, they could have an additional sign. So if they wanted to have a grand opening sign or a tent sale sign or a now hiring, whatever, magic kind of thing they want to have. Or, it could be political, it could be, Happy Easter, whatever the message is, they can do a slightly larger sign. So that's the toughest way to go, but the most legally defensible because we do not have any reference to message. So this is almost 50-50, and since 2015, this is about 50-50 which way communities go. Because the alternative is we split it down commercial versus non-commercial. So for the non-commercial stuff, without commercial message, we have this top language that basically is like, we're not going to get, don't post it on utility poles, don't do anything like that. They're yard signs, they can be window signs, banner signs, and that they can be a maximum area of 32 square feet on any lot, maximum height of individual signs. We do not regulate the total amount or the number. The maximum height is 6 feet, and there's no time limits to it, but you're subject to the maintenance. The thought behind this is that 98% of the time, people self-regulate, right? So yeah, during election season, everybody's going to have a ton of signs out, but for the most part, they rein them in soon after the election. And then they might be using them for real estate or garage sales or whatever they need, the traditional stuff for. Are we going to have people that are going to put yard signs out year round because they don't like who was elected or they got an issue with the city? Yeah, I think we all are probably familiar with examples of that in the region. Everywhere, everybody is. But it's one way of knowing that of all the places you're gonna risk yourself getting sued, it's on regulating somebody's political or opinion or free speech. So we kind of just are like, keep it out of the right of way, no bigger than the plywood, we're staying out of it. And then you have these separate regulations for, excuse me, for the commercial signs. In which case we do say, okay, on a residential lot, you can have 2 small commercial signs. Thinking that you might have a real estate sign and a garage sale sign up at the same time. You might have a real estate sign and a contractor sign, or a contractor sign and an event sign, because those are commercial activity. You know, you might have any combination throughout the year, you might have that. So you give them the option to have a couple of signs for commercial speech. And the same with the commercial districts, that they would get, you know, 2 kind of smaller commercial temporary signs year round, and then a larger one on a, like, kind of a timed basis. This is a little bit easier from an administration enforcement standpoint because, again, largely surrounding the issues with political season. I mean, I hate to, that is where the kind of big sign issues come into play. So it's a little bit easier on enforcement, it's a little bit easier on administration, but it is obviously, there's this thing where we are glancing at a sign to see is it a commercial or non-commercial message. We could do this before 2015. The 2015 case didn't specifically say you can't do it. It didn't specifically say you can continue to do it. Our lower courts have been okay with it so far, but that's all. So I am going to pose this to Marvin and see where the legal department wants to go. But I want to put this out here to see if you have any questions or thoughts on one. If you know, again, this is where we can ask questions, but one way or another, it's sticky. And there's, again, you can kind of see where there's issues on both sides. Thoughts?
Kind of see what Marvin says too, I suppose.
Yeah.
Legend, politics, all that stuff is sticky.
Yeah. And I've worked, this is the one thing where there's not a lot of consistency amongst law. If you ask me, can you deal with the obscenity that everybody is dealing with now? That is the one place every legal department, every law director, every private lawyer I've met has had the same consistent answer on is don't touch it. Mm-hmm. The only time. The rest of this is where I do get a mixed response depending on the community. So, I don't know, Joshua, as the, you have, yeah. Did you have?
Oh, I just had a question.
Yeah.
From doing this for a long time, have you ever gotten it posed to you that if you limit the number of signs, you're actually limiting content?
So, not that you are limiting content, you are limiting speech.
Speech.
Yes, yeah. So that is, and that's where the First Amendment comes into play, right? You're limiting speech. Now,
It's a big one.
that's what, exactly, it is a big one. And this is why you don't want to get sued on it, because you're in trouble. So yes, but this is where it's kind of peculiar, because the courts have always said, you as a government can regulate the structures on which signs are attached to, which is why you can, you know, have a certain limit on the number of temporary signs, and you can talk about temporary signs from yard signs and stuff. However, they have also, there is a court case, not anywhere near here, I think it's in like Alabama or something, where one community thought they were clever, and they said, okay, you can only have, I think it was 3 temporary signs on your property at any one time, like 3 little ones. And the court said, yeah, that's not enough. So there is a point, this is where it's funny, where the courts are very like, we'll tell you when you're wrong, but not what the right answer is. So there is a point where they will say, if you only allow a certain amount, a limited number, you're wrong. We just don't know, is it 4? Is it 5? Is it 6? What is it?
So is some communities, do they just stay away from the number?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's where the second one goes with again, with the free speech is like, we're not gonna try to get into telling you can only have X square feet, because, you know, again, this is gonna be a big election. I probably should just go out the day before and just take pictures across the city, because anybody's gonna have signs out.
Starting in October.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I just think right before it gets really, you know, and I think no matter how any community has written their regulations, I think there's just gonna be a lot of ignoring the rules, because as long as you keep it out of the right of way. But I've also had communities who have relied on self-regulation and have said, you know what, that with that content neutral stuff, we aren't going to limit the number. We just don't want anything bigger than 32 square feet, because the reality is you'll probably, you know, temporary or political ones will be 32 square feet, and just hope for the best. I have had one community who's just like, we're gonna count on everybody being good. And, you know, again, for newer subdivisions where there's HOAs, the HOAs can deal with it, that,
Right.
you know,
Right.
let them do it. But anywhere else, you're gonna deal with this. I have communities who, if you want a digital sign in your commercial district, then you don't get any temporary yard signs or temporary banner signs, because you've got the quintessential tool to do temporary messages.
Marketing banner. Yeah.
Huh?
Marketing banner, right?
Yeah, so you
That's
get
it
a
right
choice.
there,
You can do the digital sign and have temporary messages, but then you don't get the temporary yard signs or banners, or you can have the temporary yard signs and banners, but you don't get the digital signs. So there's communities that have done kind of that,
Either
depending on
or.
your party, yeah.
I mean, or.
Yeah. You still get your ability to have quick messages and temporary messages. It's just the structure that's supporting it. Well, so I'm putting this out here. I will talk to Marvin, because if he could say, well, this makes sense, but this is not the way we want to put our risk, or, you know, put our necks out there, and he may go. So I will see what he has to say, but beyond this, there is not much we can do other than tweaking the numbers. One of the things that I did add in here is that I did not find anything that really would have spoken to sidewalk signs, especially in like downtown. So I have accommodated those in here. However, you would have to have a sidewalk of, so if you would have to have a wide enough sidewalk to have 4 foot of clearance. So, you know, you would have to have about 7 feet of sidewalk width. So in your new commercial things, they're not gonna be able to do it. In downtown, on certain streets they may, on other ones they wouldn't. But that's the only way you would be able to get, like, to put a sidewalk, a temporary sidewalk sign out there. They would have to be pulled in at business close and all that type of thing, but that's kind of a traditional way that we look, that communities are accommodating those little sandwich board signs that are out front. Any other questions? That's a tough one. I always have to give everybody the, like, Debbie Downer story of signs, but I wish there was we're hoping, unfortunately, that there are other communities willing to get sued and take it up to the Supreme Court to get the answers, but until then, a lot of people, what happens,
R&D.
yeah, a lot of people have been a little, like, concerned, and so they just, if they get sued, they kind of stop it right then and fix it, and just, we aren't seeing those challenges yet. The good news is, we do know that surprisingly, in 2022, we do know that the Supreme Court did come back with a decision, and technically, I see it as content neutral, or content-based regulation, but they said it's not. We can look at on-premise versus off-premise. So you can look at a sign and go, is that an on-premise sign, or is that an off-premise sign? Okay, cool. They said it's not content-based, but I'm like, really? How do you know? You have to read it. But that was, like, shockingly, like, I was really surprised that came down. So, you know, we have this, part of this rule is that your commercial signage has to be on-premise. So you know, the billboard kind of situation goes away by that nature. All right, I'm gonna zoom out a little bit. Subdivision design and public improvements. I talked to Joshua a little bit about this, because other than your process and your guarantees, you did not have much of anything related to standards for subdivisions in your actual code, which is unusual. So I was like, hey, what standards are you using? Well, fortunately, yeah, he gave me some guidance. So you, for like streets and stuff, are using ODOT's manuals, and so I worked that in. Your water and sewer and sidewalks are all addressed in another part of the codified ordinances. It just isn't referenced really well. So a lot of this is cross-referencing the appropriate standards and manuals elsewhere. But I've made this a little bit more robust to reflect some of the more common aspects of subdivision. The other reason why I did rename this subdivision design and public improvements is because these standards apply not only to situations where there is a division of land, but if some developer comes into, let's say, one of your big industrial lots or their big commercial lots, and they need to extend public sewer, you know, without dividing land, they still would be subject to this. They still have to meet your water and sewer standards. So if they extend any public improvements or streets, even if there's no land development, they have to go through this same process. So we want that. This is another reason why we try to kind of stay away from it just being about subdivisions. So when we get down to the conformity and development plans and standards, here's where I went through your current codified ordinances and try to catch anything of importance. So part 9 of the codified ordinances, streets, utilities, public services code is going to be a big one. That really gets into your water and your sewer. 711 of the Ohio Revised Code has some certain requirements for platting. And then per my discussion with Joshua, most of the street design standards are coming from the Ohio Department of Transportation street design manuals. You have no reference to that here now, so we have included that reference. Now, down the line, you may all develop your own street design standards or street design manual or do something different, in which case you just update this section to say, you know, see the new Philadelphia, you know, set of standards. But this at least triggers the threshold that you are at least holding ODOT standards as the minimum. Sale of land and subdivision started construction. So you do not have this. This is actually in the ORC, but we elevate it here a little bit. You cannot sell a lot if it has not been recorded. And actually there is a big penalty if you do. So while it is in the Ohio Revised Code, it is under the statutory requirements. We'll put it in here. Responsibility and timing of public improvements. So they have to be installed prior to the final recording of a plat, or what happens most of the time is they put up a financial guarantee of a certain amount to cover the cost. They record, and then, you know, they're improving it, but they can get it recorded. And then if they fail to finish the public improvements, the city has that guarantee to go in and finish the improvements. That follows along the lines of the language that you do have in the current standards. The one thing I did note is that and this might be a couple of questions for the folks down this line here, is the current language in 1121 seems to only require a performance bond for streets, but wouldn't you require a bond for all public infrastructure? Like if they're gonna put in public sewer.
Doesn't it already do that? The bond? She's asking.
Their performance bond.
The performance bond.
Yeah.
And the utilities?
We just have it for the roads and then the curbs and sidewalks.
Yeah.
Typically.
So you don't do it for utilities?
Well, no, because they're gonna do that right off the rip before they do anything.
Okay.
And they get some PTI. That study also has to be in through the EPA.
So that's all done through your chapter 9?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's all done. And it's all in before they can do anything. And then the only thing we take it on is really truly just for the road.
So streets, curb, gutter, and sidewalks.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes.
Okay, that's why I was like, I want to make sure that we, you know, that kind of thing.
Yes.
And then the other follow-up question is, some communities do this and some don't, is do you and it's not in there, or would you want to require a maintenance agreement and a maintenance bond for, okay, the city accepts it, and for you put up a smaller percentage of the cost of those improvements, or the roads, so that in 2 years, if there's potholes or things that, you know, obviously it was not put up to par, that you have like a 2-year maintenance thing where you can come back and force them to fix it, or you've got a bond to fix it.
We never have, because it typically,
It's always-
over the year mark, before we would even think about taking it over,
Okay,
because, you know, they don't, and truly what it is the base is in, like on the road, and then when they finally top it, when most of the lots are sold, so it's probably, you're almost pushing the 2 years before,
they even put the top coat on.
exactly,
Okay.
yes.
And again, this is one, I think part of it is the changing way that subdivisions going in, because I am seeing fewer communities require maintenance agreement or maintenance bond, but there still are out there, so I always ask.
And
the question.
I would see a great need for that if you, like some of the bigger cities I see where they come in and put a place in and they put all the road in, they put some sidewalk or put some curb in, and it's up and down, okay, we wanna walk away, we're done, and now you just sell it to everybody that would wanna build a house, and here you go. I could see wanting to do it with that, but typically ours have all been, I don't know that we usually get a turnaround on one, maybe 15, 16 months in.
Okay.
It's an individual person. It's not a group that goes in, like I say, it says, I wanna take in a lot that has 50 places, I wanna put all the infrastructure in, and free for all for everybody, and I'm out of here.
Yeah, and 2 years is the limit I've ever seen them make. Most of them
Yeah.
are 1 year, so okay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yep.
All right. And then as far as that, the other thing is, this is a question probably for you, so most of the cases, we've got the Director of Public Service, we've changed it out to Code Administrator. But then again, the bonds, this may be an instance where you are the one that would be releasing it, and if that's so, then we would keep it as the Director.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, please. I don't
Just-
know much about utilities.
Well, you can always learn, come on.
Wendy,
Yeah,
just to clarify, you guys could probably help me on this. So when the subdivisions come to my committee, I always ask for all the paperwork and written copies of the written bonds, you know, or a letter from, Ron. So does that have to say in there, it has to have written proof?
so yes, it does. It would come at the time, so you are seeing it after it's gone through the preliminary plat, probably.
Yes,
So
yeah.
so preliminary plat, they're not showing any proof of that, they're just showing the design, the concept of it. It's then that they submit all the public improvement plans, and at that point, they have to demonstrate proof. Before they can move forward, they have to submit written proof. And in fact, the language I have in here is the type of financial guarantees, and it even has in both cases that basically it's in a form approved by the law director. So the law director is okay with how they're guaranteeing it. The one question I have is that you do speak to, so I included this as, you could do certified check or a wire transfer. You guys only speak to actual bonding. If you want to just keep it at bonds, I'll leave it in there, but a lot of communities do accept checks or a certified check or a wire transfer, so I didn't know if that was an option you would accept.
I think the last time we had them,
They're usually not doing it, but it is,
yeah,
you see it,
we do have them do that. I think the last one, and what we do, just so everybody knows, is like the top coat. We'll go, Newton's does Pride Night, which is a asphalt company in town. Okay, price that out, price it times 2 years from now, and that's what we make them hold. So whatever that is for the road, that's the bond that they make us have. And usually the last time though, we did it in a check, did we not, Josh?
I only know about SWIP ones.
Yeah, but typically, the last time we did have it, he just had a line of credit, is what they actually showed, not a check, just had a line of credit.
yeah, we'll call that a letter of credit or
Yeah.
something. So you will allow those alternatives.
Yeah.
I try to be very clear what types will be accepted and how they, like you said, how are they documented and proven
Yeah,
that they are, okay.
yeah, and then we do allow that, yes. If you wanna add that.
Yeah. just some form, yeah, again, it's, over the years, some communities are a little bit more restrictive on what kind of guarantee they'll take, so. And then when we get into this section, this is a lot of stuff that you don't have now that is just common practice for subdivisions. And when I say it, you're gonna be like, yeah, that makes total sense. So, for example, the general suitability of land for development, as well as the topography, floodplains and areas, obviously you want them to be designing around those, you know, topography and around the floodplains and wetlands and stuff. So this gives them, the planning commission, when they're looking at preliminary plats, a little bit more guidance about just general design principles of subdivisions. Subdivision names, that they're not supposed to be duplicative. You know, you don't want Deerfield Estates in 2 parts of the city, let alone in the county. The shade trees, the planning commission this I think is language that you have kind of currently in your somewhere in the provision that we've kept that in. Traffic control devices, debris and waste, all of these again are common practices. And then the 2 other ones that I've included here is you do not have any, other than the minimum lot area, you know, our minimum zoning district requirements, you don't have any guidance for the design of lots or blocks, which is the, you know, basically a literal block, that I have just taken some best practices and incorporated them in here. So that, for example, you know, the lot arrangement and design shall be such that all lots will provide satisfactory building sites. You know, knowing the setbacks going into this, knowing the setbacks, knowing the size requirements, you should be having building lots that can accommodate whatever the use is allowed in that district, because you don't want them to come back and play dumb later on and say, oh, yeah, our lots are too small to accommodate, you know, the house size you want. That they generally are rectangular in form, unless there's some kind of, you know, just some real basic, you know, trying to keep these nice and neat. Excessive length in relation to width ratio shall be avoided, so the bowling alley lots, those type of things. And the same with blocks, just some real simple basic standards that almost every community has. You know, so generally you want blocks that have two tiers of lots, unless it's kind of one that's backing up on a highway. A lot of times you won't have that kind of thing.
That's one that this group here will have to keep in mind moving forward. If we get a new, you know, subdivision, we have to follow that. Okay.
And again, these are probably ones that you're already thinking of when you look at it. And most subdivision, anybody with any little minor background in subdivision processing is going to put that, they're going to be able to easily comply with this. You know, or they will make the argument that there's some kind of weird topography, so they can't do 2 tiers of lots. Okay, well, that's fine. That makes sense. But if you've just got a big flat area of land and you're putting streets in, you know.
Pretty easy, yeah.
Yeah. So these aren't anything that they shouldn't already be doing, but this is just setting the base standard.
Should have done that on the south side years ago when they developed it.
Yep,
It's a mess down there.
exactly.
Yeah. Street design, again, there's not a lot in here because you rely on the manual for, from ODOT, but these are things like, you know, the street layout should provide access to all lots and parcels within the subdivision. We've got a lot of access control and major arterials. You have to take into consider the ODOT standards for that, or the cities. You know, these again are all practical guidelines for common sense stuff type things. Street name, signs, and numbering, again, not having duplicative information. The numbering, I tied that to your codified ordinances. You have a numbering system, 907. And then, while it's rare, I did speak to half streets. There are, on occasion, subdividers who want to be cute and be like, I am not, you know, building this phase of my my subdivision until later, but half of it will be in the township, or half of it we'll do later. And so they'll look at showing you a half street, that with the intention that eventually it'll be, you know, no, don't do that.
It'll be a full street, yeah.
Sidewalks. So, Chapter 903 sets out the width of requirements for sidewalks outside of business districts, so in residential districts. But 90302 on the width of sidewalks in business districts does not actually establish the width.
Somewhere it says it's supposed to be from curb to front property line, but I'll have to look for it,
Okay,
for business districts.
I read that section 3 times going, you're saying this is where the width
It's
is, but
probably
there's
stuck
no
in
width.
random somewhere,
From sidewalk to what?
front
Curb.
property line. Like, curb to front property line.
Okay.
And I'm not sure, let me look for it while we're here.
Yeah, who knows what section you may end up finding it in.
Well, it's
Yeah.
actually
So
903,
random.
903.02, within a business district.
Yeah, and what does it say?
All sidewalks in the business portions of the city shall be constructed to extend from the property line to the curb. That was updated in 1998.
Okay, I did not read it that way, or I'm looking at an older version, so, okay.
That, I mean, that, oh, okay, all the other ones, all right, never mind. Move forward.
The other thing I want to talk to you about regarding sidewalks is there's no specific requirements to put sidewalks in. So there's actually, I don't read that language to say you have to put sidewalks in. It's just if you do, this is the standard. And so my question is, now's the point to say, where do you want to have sidewalks? Is it all residential, all commercial? Industrial goes back and forth on people, you know, whether or not you want to require a sidewalk. But I think this is the point where we need to add, you know, where you want to mandate sidewalks to be placed in.
I know when they come through here, right, we've always said we won't accept it without the sidewalks and curbs. So yeah, but if we need to have something in there, you're right, Wendy, yeah, we do. If we have no ground to say that, but we won't accept anything. I've never seen anything in the last 8 years. You've been here a lot longer than I have, Dick. I mean, most of the stuff I know, everything that I've done, I don't okay anything unless it has the sidewalks.
I can't remember when we.
Like, we won't accept the plot even until that's in or we make it happen, but if we need something in that spells that out, yes, let's do that.
Okay. And then the other part of this, though, is then what about industrial districts? Would you, if somebody came in and did another industrial subdivision, would you require sidewalks in that?
I would say yes.
I mean, they can always appeal, they can always ask, so if you recall back to the procedures, the planning commission is reviewing plats. And there is a process of a subdivision modification, which is a variance of standards in this chapter. So any other variances go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, but if you're varying technical requirements for subdivisions, you can get that approved with the planning commission. We can put in there that they are required across the board unless, and give them some examples, like, for example, I can't think of the name of your industrial economic activity out there by the university, where it is huge lots.
Tax card.
Yeah, it's huge lots that may not, you know, functionally up a hill and that kind of thing, so that the practicality of sidewalks may not make sense, and in that case, the planning commission could modify that in a, you know, a very limited scenario.
I see, like, let's just say, guys, down at, going back to Battle Motors, I think that would look nice if this was sidewalks.
Yeah.
Back.
Yeah, and you've got employees that walk, at lunchtime they walk,
Yeah.
and that'll be even more popular.
Or let's just say the one that we may see something happen with soon is the Howden property, right? That'd be nice to
Right.
probably have sidewalks.
100%.
You know, along that, you know, I know it's not
Yep.
going exactly anywhere yet, but, you know,
If
if
and
you
when.
had sidewalks further
Right,
down.
that's a recreational area, there are kids
Right.
there all the
Yep.
time.
Yeah, you see what I'm getting at? So I would think, yeah, I would like to see it addressed, but
I would like
Yeah.
to see it put in, and then we could, if they can present a good reason. that
Under
it's not-
very limited circumstances.
yes.
Yeah, cause
That
you're
they
gonna
can
run
run.
into somewhere where it's no, like Tech Park, if it's.
Well, and there's
got a
cases,
grade.
yeah, there's also variations where communities have said, yeah, well, okay, you are required to have them in every subdivision. You might be able to ask for a waiver from one side under like topographical things. Okay, well, if topography is a problem, we're not gonna make you put it up both sides, but you're gonna have some kind of sidewalk. And so, you know, it's kind of one of those balancing things, so, okay. Underground utility distribution communication facilities, this is something new to consider because you really don't mention, I mean, I know electric is dealt with outside of it, But this is basically saying if you can put it underground, put it underground. And, you know, it expands beyond telephone now that you have, you know, all kinds of stuff, cable and fiber and all that type of thing. Easements, again, this is just stuff, I didn't see much in Title IX regarding any easement requirements, so I didn't know if you wanted to have some basic easement requirements. A lot of communities require a minimum amount of easement outside of the right-of-way to accommodate like rear infrastructure, utilities and the like.
Okay, so you mean like in alleys?
Yeah. And you don't have to answer me now. This may be one I just send to you as a side note
Would
to
you
think about.
please?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, cause then we're gonna have to get that stuff recorded and everything.
You mean the vacated alleys?
No, just like any backyard in an alley, if the alley's only 14 feet wide and we need an extra 4 feet of
Yeah.
for utilities, we could get an easement with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the final section on this is green infrastructure. This is an option, not a mandatory requirement. But there's all kinds of growing discussions about, you know, dealing with stormwater in a more natural way. This gives them the option, if they can come up with something that meets best practices out there in the engineering world, they can present that to Planning Commission to consider as part of the preliminary plat. So they have an alternative to look at the green infrastructure, and we give some examples of what that is, but it would have to be signed off by Planning Commission and by the engineering. And when we say city engineer, it's either staff or a consulting engineer that you may be working with. So this is just an option rather than a mandate.
Covered already under the wastewater ordinance?
And that's it. That's still like 5 pages longer than you have,
Covered already under the wastewater?
Green?
which is mostly the process, so.
No.
Um,
Okay.
and then the
This is
final,
Huh?
the last
This is how.
final major section of the code is nonconformity. So quote unquote, the grandfathering rules.
This is what Josh has been waiting for.
Oh yeah, we've talked about this.
I'm ready. Roll up my sleeves.
So I was just making sure where we are. So, the grandfathering, this is again dealing with anything that was legally built beforehand that may not be allowed now. Hopefully, fingers crossed, by some of the work we've done, we've actually reduced the number of nonconformities. We've done a lot of work. Like, one of the things that I'm working on is spot checking some of the sign changes to hopefully, we have not created nonconformities, we are reducing them where it makes sense. But there's always gonna be nonconformities, so let's just go with that. So, general provisions, one of the questions I have is, so the burden of proof is always on the person coming to you and saying, listen, I've had this forever, you know, and I should be allowed to continue. One of the things that I put in here as a question of the city as to whether or not you want to do this for your insanity is some communities know when they had, know kind of a general date when after it they have fairly good records of what was built or what was done or what was required. And before that, it's a little gray of what was the thing. And at which point they kind of put that as the line in the sand. They say, hey, listen, if you come to us with anything that was built, you know, before 1985, whatever date, we're going to be under the assumption that it was built legally, okay? You know, unless proven otherwise. Versus, you know, tell us how, you know, show us that it was built legally. Other communities don't put that line in the sand; they just leave it the burden on the proof. So I don't know if that's where you are. If you've got kind of a general idea of when you've got good enough records that you would make that stand that, yeah, we know that you built that incorrectly. I'm looking at
Yeah.
I can see it both ways.
Yeah, I know.
But I was
And there's
always-
no, and let me reassure you, there's no right way to do this.
Right.
It's really what you feel like. What's the battle you're gonna pick?
I was gonna agree to it, and then I start thinking about like some of these corners of tight areas where these old buildings sit right along the right of way.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, if that's non-conforming and not used for a while, it'd be nice to get rid of it. But also, if you have a date to go from, that can make things a lot simpler. I mean, we've got building permits up there clear back to the sixties, but the bad part is, there was too many good old boy handshakes through the years where either they didn't get a permit to build that, or someone said, yeah, I know you, go ahead and do that.
Well, ultimately, whatever the line in the sand is, if you use the date system, you know, let's say it's 1960, you could always, kind of go a little further back than you think, but let's say 1960 is the date. Ultimately, if it's something that you can say by the auditor, hey, this wasn't built to 1967, so, and you're telling me it was built legally, and I'm saying I don't have any evidence of that, you need to show, that after that, it's after that point, that date is when you're telling people, if we don't have the records for it, then you need to prove to us somehow, some way. And I serve as a on-call review planner for a small village in the Cincinnati area. And I've literally had people be like, look, I've got this blueprint of a fence. So obviously the fence has been there since 1980. And I was like, okay, that's a very beautiful blueprint of a fence that doesn't show that it was built. But I can show you in Google Street View that it wasn't there in 2018 or something like that, that kind of thing. So, again, part of it is, but there are other communities, like with another big distinction is like non-conforming uses. So over the course of time, a house was divided into like 2 units. And a lot of times this was done historically, long before, zoning was around. And they're able to pull like either building records or utilities to say, look, we've had split utilities for, a very long time with no issue from the city. You guys are the ones sending me the bill, and that will be enough to demonstrate compliance. With regards to what you were saying, where you've got a lot of these older buildings built on the right-of-way, that wouldn't it be nice to get away with? I don't want us to forget that one of the things, depending on what type of building it is, one of the things we built into this code was that adaptive reuse, conditional use. Right. Where if there's a building that is of a unique nature that it couldn't like actively be used for, because of their design, couldn't be used for some permitted use, like a church in a residential or a industrial building that's now residential, there is a way that they could possibly reuse that without tearing it down. So I can let you chew on whether that, I'm looking at you, Joshua, specifically on this one because...
I kind of like the date thing because then, it's kind of like with what we're doing with this code. As soon as this code's out, anything that was before that is either grandfathered in, we're starting fresh. It's just less of a headache, like you said.
Well, and our record keeping in the past has not been good.
Right, so we got to draw a line somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, and the line is, where is there a presumptive assumption that you have built something legally?
Right.
That prior to,
would we use our...
something built in 1950, are you really going to try to force you or them to try to figure out that it was done with the proper permits or whatever, versus something built in 2000?
Because in the 70s, if they got a variance, we're probably not going to find a record of it anyhow.
Go ahead, Kelly.
I was just gonna say, if it falls under commercial, Dick and I was talking, when did Port Authority start?
I know they start taking electronic records in like 2018, but it goes back a little further than that.
Oh, it's been at least 20 years.
Yeah.
But they have the same issue, I think, because I've called and asked things, and they're like, well, we ain't going to find that.
As an example, I'll tell you, the city that I first wrote this for was Sharonville, Ohio, which is like more of an industrial base, right outside. It's the first suburb out of Cincinnati. They used 1980, they actually had a very specific date, like September something. I don't know why they came up, but it was 1985. So, it goes back even more than the 20 years. But again, that was based on a couple of different record-keeping systems they had.
Yeah.
I don't know what year would be best. The last code was majorly overhauled in 87. Do we use that as the time, or was bulk of that code based off a change in 1970? I don't know, past them.
I can touch base with you after. I keep looking at you because this is gonna be
Right.
really
Part of me
more
just
in your
wants to set a date
ballpark.
And say, we move forward after that date.
Yeah,
Cause it's not like we're gonna be tearing these buildings down, you know, the city won't be.
right.
I mean, unless there's other things wrong with it, not
Mhm.
just cause it's not being used. If it's a good building, we're not gonna go rip it down.
Right. All right, well, I'll touch base with you on that, you know, trying to figure out what that's gonna be. You have in your current language a note that or like a conditional use is not considered non-conforming because they got approved. That still applies. What I have also put in here, though, is there may be instances where we made a use that was permitted before, we've changed it to conditional use in this new version. And this includes an assumption that, you know, if you were permitted and you became a conditional use, you are presumptively assumed to have gotten approved conditional use. So it's not like everybody who went to a conditional use has to come in and get a permit that they are legal. We're just saying you are assumed that you are legally conforming as a conditional use. And then the same with non-conforming variances. This is kind of trying to reassure anybody that if you came in yesterday or whatever and got a variance, that as long as you comply with whatever that variance is, you are not considered non-conforming. So the variance would rule and makes you conforming. Non-conforming uses, so this, okay, well, this is, so the one thing that you have now that I have maintained, and I would strongly retain, is you have very clear distinctions between a non-conforming use, which is the use is not allowed in that zoning district, but you were in place for so long. So the quintessential one is always that I go to is like the old gas station that's in a residential district, right? It's been around forever. That use is obviously not allowed in a residential district anymore, so it's a non-conforming use. Versus a non-conforming structure or site where the use is okay, a house in a residential district, but the building's too tall, it's in a setback, it's, you know, it doesn't meet the minimum dwellings, you know, any of those type of lot requirements, or in a commercial district, you don't meet the parking requirements or the landscaping. Your use is fine, but the site itself is off. And then non-conforming lots, where your lot's too small or not wide enough. So we have different rules based on, you know, obviously non-conforming uses are the ones that you want to try to deal with first, and then non-conforming structures, you know, the use is okay, so we're already kind of halfway there. We deal with that separately. So when we first start talking about non-conforming uses, you know, I honestly, you had pretty good regulations, just let me say that here. One of the things I did, we retained is that if you discontinue a non-conforming use, so that gas station in a residential district, if you stop it for a year, it goes away. You can no longer come back as a gas station. And there are court cases of this, and we have this language in here, that this last line here, the intent to continue a non-conforming use should not be evidence of a continuance. So let's say they shut down their business, but they're trying to sell it as a gas station. Well, as long as it wasn't operational for 12 months, the selling of it does not protect it. It has to be operational. So that is a new kind of addition to that. Termination of the use. The one change I have put in here, in A here, is if you have a non-conforming residential use anywhere, you can rebuild within the same footprint if 100% of that house builds down. Here's why. And I've gotten a couple of these recently as part of my little village work. Banks are not as often financing homes that are not conforming, because they do not want to finance a house that cannot be rebuilt. And they will, Joshua, you've probably gotten many a request for a question about can they rebuild. And so most communities are starting to say non-conforming residential uses you can burn to the ground and we will let you rebuild for a couple reasons. One, they don't want to stick somebody with not being able to sell their house because it can't find a financer. And two, most communities don't want to tell somebody they can't rebuild their house. So that is a new provision that you do not have, and I want to pause here and see how everybody feels about that, because that is a big change. We're not giving the same protection to non-conforming commercial uses or non-residential uses, but that is a big change. So thoughts on that one? And again, I don't know how many of these you have, but this is very likely at this point, your non-conforming houses you might have in your office district, or some of your commercial districts where residential is not allowed.
That'd be the only thing, is if it's like, we got one in an industrial zone, it's not allowed, because most of your non-conformities everywhere else are just gonna be, it may be encroaching a setback, or
Right.
it's
Correct.
lot coverage, so to me, no issue with that at all, letting someone rebuild their home, but the only stipulation would be, what if it's in an industrial zone or something where we don't want houses to continue? But then again, are we gonna be the bad guy that not lets that person rebuild their home there, so.
And there, I mean, that is the question that you're gonna have to ask from a policy standpoint. Because you're also, it's not just rebuilding it, you're also, if you say, like, let's say we accept it in the industrial districts and say, no, you don't get this provision in industrial districts, you're also telling them they may not be able to sell their house, because if they can't find somebody to finance it, to buy it, because a bank won't finance it.
And if we don't let them rebuild, that's gotta be a lawsuit coming, I would think, a fight.
How many situations do we have like that?
I'm gonna throw this out here, that we do have some residential housing and industrial, but as part, when we get shown the new map, I wanna bring up, I think some of these parcels should be rezoned anyhow.
That's what I forgot to send.
Because,
I have a draft back.
Exactly.
like in the northeast end of town where
I
North
talked to
Avenue
Keith.
goes up to a private drive, a lot of those houses, all those parcels are zoned industrial, and several of them are just a home sitting on there. Why it was zoned industrial before, maybe there were plans before, but now, I think when we're redoing these districts, those should be switched, because the rest of it, like going up towards Central Catholic and stuff, some of those tucked in is one example. So we don't have a lot of areas, and most of the zones allow for, at least now, housing in
Yeah.
different districts as a principal use. I don't think that's changing too much.
We're allowing, where residential, standalone residential allowed now, we're probably allowing it. Where, one of the things we are expanding on is mixed use, you can do more often, so the apartments above, it's not just in downtown.
I think right now, industrial is the only zone that housing's not allowed in our code now. So if something happened now,
And speaking of which, I do have a draft zoning map, so I will send that tomorrow when I have another meeting tonight. I will send that tomorrow to everybody to take a look at. It's currently based on your current map with the changes, like, obviously, the big change is we have multiple residential districts, so you will start to see how we broke that out. But if it was industrial now, it is industrial then,
Right.
unless it was a public facility because we created that, so the airport becomes a public
there's
facility.
probably a few you aren't aware of. There's not a lot, but I think we could correct that now, and then moving forward, we're not gonna allow anybody to build a house in industrial moving
Right.
forward anyhow, so.
Yeah.
I'm okay with letting people rebuild their homes, because we can correct that now. That's
Well, and
not-
at that point, the other thing you have to keep in mind is they may not want to rebuild. I mean, if it burns down and they can get their insurance and get out, they may be more likely to just get out. But there's always a slim chance that I've heard every story there is, so yeah, that they might want to rebuild. With the rest of things outside of residential, we have kept your 50% rule, which is, if it's destroyed over 50% of reconstruction value, you cannot rebuild as that use. You have to build in compliance with the code. That's a pretty common percentage, the 50 value. The one question I have, though, is how do you establish reconstruction value?
I mean, I'd double that question. We'd have to hire someone to come and tell us.
So there's a couple ways that communities do it. The simplest way is not speak to construction value, but is to speak to the auditor's market value, their determined market value, which tends to be lower than actual reconstruction value. I mean, just from my own experiences, I can't reconstruct my house or my industrial buildings to that value, but that is the simplest way without bringing in like appraisers. The other one is that you basically, the reconstruction value is presented by the applicant, and if the city disputes that, then the city can hire their own appraiser, and then the applicant and the city agree on a third mutual appraiser, so there's three. So one is by the applicant, one is the city, and then one is a mutually appointed one, and you look at the three combined. That's the more complicated one, so that is the alternative.
Is there any other options besides value? Do other cities just do like total percentage of the structure's gone, like 50% of the structure's gone, or is it most people just do?
Most do is the value. I can't say that I've ever seen a percentage of.
Anything different than value?
I think there was one, and I think we got rid of it. I think there was one, I vaguely remember a long time ago that it was volume of so like the volume of a house, but I was like, okay, who's doing that, John, or that kind of calculation, so.
If that's standard, I'm all right with leaving it. I just didn't know if there was a simpler version that a lot of communities use instead of value.
It's just, so again, I think the simpler is to still use a value, but a lot of times they just use the auditor's value because that's the easiest one to point to as an established number that that's the number. And if you can't rebuild it to that, or you could say it's 125% of the auditors, whatever, so, because again, I'm not aware of a lot of people that could rebuild based on what the auditors have said.
Especially prices.
Yeah.
No way.
You built something 20 years ago and you gotta rebuild it now, it's gonna cost a lot more money.
So could you get that figure, more of a ballpark from the insurance company? Cause I know when we pay our house insurance, they have on there, this is a rebuild value, what it would cost to rebuild your house.
I've never seen it that way, but I'm not opposed to that way. I guess the question is, what kind of proof would you require? I mean, basically, if you want to do that, show us your policy to show you what the reconstruction value is. Otherwise, I mean, we could say that. We could say, here's your alternatives. You can share with I feel uncomfortable forcing them to give you their insurance policy, but you could say, listen, your options are, you can show us the insured reconstruction value, and if it's more than 50% of that, we're done. And the alternative is, if you don't want to do that, then we use it as a percentage of the auditors.
I was just wondering if that could be another data point.
Yes, it is. There are several systems out there, and most insurance agents use the VEX system. You plug in the square footage, and you can talk about how the house is constructed, and they come up with the replacement cost. I mean, and we do that every day. That's how we come to an insurance value of the house, and insurance companies, they want you to build it back the way it was.
Right.
And if you want to, like Josh was talking, if you expect them to take the money and go somewhere else, they're going to pay you an appreciated value because they want you to build back where the house is,
right,
and the same square footage. If you're going to take that money, I'm going to go down the street, they're going to give you a lot less money for your house than what it is, because the idea is to put you back the way you were prior to the loss. Because you get in the moral hazard, a lot of people, hey, I don't want to live here anymore, so I'll burn my house down. Take the insurance money and go somewhere else. Well, they don't want you to do that. They shouldn't. But there is a lot of systems out there as far as establishing replacement costs on houses.
Well, and I think the big thing to keep in mind here is this is also a situation where there's a dispute if it's 50% or not, right? I mean,
be a little damage or a lot of damage.
Correct. Most of the time, it's like the roof got thrown off. Okay, you're probably going to be like, I'm not. Just fix your roof. It's fine. But a lot of times, unfortunately, it's damage that you're like, come on, you're going to have to take it all down before you can put it back up. All right, I will play around with some, but yeah, value one way or another is still the go-to.
Okay. I mean, I'm fine with 50%, because if it's 75% damage and it was non-conforming payment cut, we can say it can't go back there, but that's strictly residential. Do we have that for
so
commercial?
With for the residential is A here, and it's basically, if it doesn't matter what percentage it is, so we don't have a value determined. If a residential, that rule I told you about is it could be 20% or it could be 100%, you can rebuild. Everything else is the 50% rule, yeah.
For building, any building other,
The residential use, yeah.
What are we doing with, like if a house was up, like, maybe think of when you talked about back there northeast by North Avenue. Aren't some of those in the floodplain?
Yes.
Okay, if it burns down or tore down, Can the city give them a permit to rebuild even though it's in the floodplain?
I don't know, Larry, would we have to get a new flood study done, or if, I don't know if those flood studies last for so long?
I haven't looked at
Is that
that,
a lot
so
of-
that's a
Like if
good
they can
question.
improve that, or they can prove that 10 years ago I got a flood study done, cause I know FEMA changes, and I heard it's gonna change here in the next few years to be even more stricter. So I don't know about that.
I actually don't know that offhand either, but I'm gonna put a note in here to check the floodplain standards for a rebuild.
It's something about, cause Dover just had to do, Dover paid to do the Crimson Cove floodplain study for that development. He was just telling me that right now it's like your land has to drain 500 gallons per foot of water. I'm just throwing numbers out there.
Right.
Well, they did it at 1,000 because they were told the federal standards are gonna move to 1,000 here in a few years. So they went over and beyond right now. But I don't understand what any of that means. It says that your property's gotta drain water, and if it's too low, then you gotta raise it
Yeah,
up.
they did something with the floodplain.
Or you can't
Kent
rebuild?
State did down
Yeah.
there in
Well,
that
that's-
area.
Yeah, they had to be.
A couple years ago.
And the floodplain's
interesting.
always gonna
I mean, it's
trump
gonna be expensive.
this,
It's
you
really
know,
true.
regardless,
Yeah.
so.
Because it's federal.
If you
Yeah.
choose to be there.
All right,
Usually they gotta raise
First
it.
Street Northwest.
non-conforming, structures and sites. So again, this is a situation where the use is fine. We're just not meeting a setback or a height or any kind of area or dimensional standard or parking or buffering or something like that. So,
Yeah.
I think, let's see, 169.
Like, can the city even permit that?
Yeah, right, it's, yeah.
So the one change I made here is on subsection A here. Right now, you do not allow for, on non-conforming structures, any expansion or enlargement or something like that. This changes it to say you can, as long as you don't increase the nonconformity. So, for example, if you've got a house that is encroaching on the front yard because they've got a patio or a porch or something in the front yard setback, but they have plenty of room in their rear, they can expand their house to the rear as long, because they're not increasing the nonconformity. You know, if it's a height issue, if they're just attaching a one-story to the rear and they're not, you know, creating a nonconformity or increasing it, they would be allowed to enlarge it. So, this is a little bit changed. It's just basically saying you can enlarge it, just you can't increase the nonconformity. So if you've got a building that's too tall and you want to extend that height further back, you can't do that. Does it make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that's also a good one to allow people to invest, even though historically they're, you know, a lot of these setback issues are historic things that obviously weren't the property owner. Yeah.
I got a question on that.
Yeah.
Or this topic, because in our code now, we have two sections that contradict. We have a section that says, you can't increase the nonconformity. So if I've got a front of a house that's only 10-foot setback where it's supposed to be 25, and they wanna build, you know, further to the side, that section says, no, you can't increase the nonconformity. But we also have, and I'm looking up here in the residential for yard requirements, that says that, front yard depth has to be 25 feet or contiguous, or it can go out with contiguous to a adjoining lot. So if that's non-conforming at 10, we have to allow people to put a 10-foot. So do we correct that in this new code? Because I don't like that. It's like you can and you can't.
So we have a similar provision. But again, it goes back to it's not considered. It's considered conforming because it addresses it. So we do have something that says if your adjacent properties are 10 feet, that you can meet that same setback, even
Is that
though
to keep
it's
that conformity in the neighborhood?
correct.
Okay.
Correct, because it's essentially it's an administrative variance without any hearing, because you're just saying, the rule is you have to meet 25 feet unless this standard is met, which is your adjacent property owners are 10 feet, or whatever it is, then you are allowed to be that. So they are not non-conforming in that case, because they are conforming with a set standard. So we have clarified when they can match their neighbors, because if you think about it, that would look odd if they were like 10, 25, 10, in a very established neighborhood.
Right.
So we've clarified that is a standard by which they can reduce a setback, but they would be considered conforming there. Now, let's say you've got a scenario where, you know, everybody is 25 feet back, but you did have one person who put that front porch on somewhere, you know, years ago, enclosed it, and now they're, you know, encroaching it, then they can't, then they are non-conforming structure, and they can't do that expansion.
Does that cover, what about same lot, my house is 3 feet off of neighbor's property line is supposed to be 5, and they wanna put a shed on at 3 feet, that would stop that, right? Cause that's continuing and that's a new.
Yes, that is a new, yeah, because
Okay.
we have a protection for front yard setbacks where like there's shallower setbacks than required. We do not have that same protection for pre-established side or rear.
Okay.
So if you have a 3-foot side setback on your house, and you're like, ooh, I wanna do that for my accessory building, the answer is no. You have to do cause you're putting in a new building
Right.
that's
I
separate.
figured, but I just.
Yeah. No, it's a good question.
The front porch thing, just to throw out something humorous, going back through old Board of Zoning Appeals meeting minutes from about 20 years ago, a guy wanted to do that, and they were told, drive around a 3-block period, area, and if you find any front porches and that meet that, then go ahead and approve it. That's why we've got a mess here, because things like that would be.
If you just find one in 3
Yes.
blocks, you can go.
That's what the meeting.
The 1 and 3 block rule.
Hey, I have seen crazier things out there, so it wouldn't surprise me. What I don't like is when it's just, well, that's not actually in the code. That's
Right.
just.
No, that's what the Board of Zoning Appeals said. We'll grant that variance if you can find someone anywhere near you that does it.
It's Wild West.
All right, so, so the rest of this is all kind of keeping it with your current language. The same goes with, like the destruction and like, you know, the front porch or something. So let's say that house is fine, the use is allowed, but it's got its porch in the front setback. If that goes 50% or more, then they lose that setback encroachment. So I will use the same determination of reconstruction value for this, but this is a case where they lose their setback, not their use. Non-conforming lots of record. So these are going to be, again, hopefully we don't have a ton of them, but non-conforming lots that don't meet the minimum lot area or lot width requirement. I did not really see any language where you dealt with that. Like, what if we have a vacant lot in the middle of the neighborhood that doesn't meet the lot area? So I have added this language that is pretty, again, best practices in most communities. So if it's a vacant lot, it can be essentially used for whatever is allowed. So if it's a residential district, it could be used for a residential because it was platted at some point, if it was legally platted. If they have, like, let's say it's one property owner owns 2 non-conforming lots together, they have to combine it. Because, you know, then we consider that a zoning lot. But otherwise, I can do it, because at some point, you have to still meet the other standards, like setbacks and stuff like that. So at some point, you're either gonna have to ask for variances on setbacks or building size, or it's just not a buildable lot. There's gonna be a point. So in like commercial settings, somebody comes in and tries to build on some sliver of a lot and they can't do the parking and stuff. At some point, you're just like, that lot isn't worth anything because you can't build on it. But otherwise, a lot of times you'll find lots that are just a few square feet short of the lot area, and you're saying you still can build on that. Non-conforming signs, fences, and walls, we address elsewhere. And then repair and maintenance, again, I said this is revised, but you have language that was pretty commonplace, so I just did some cleanup of the language. But otherwise, you still have to do all the maintenance, and nothing in this prevents somebody from maintaining their building, a non-conforming building. And that's it. The only other section that will come together, and this, so Wednesday, tomorrow, I'm going to send you the draft zoning map that I have, and I just didn't send out even though I have it in my notes. So you can start taking a look at that, and we'll talk about that. But the other thing I will be sending out here is the entire code with all of these changes we have been talking about. It will still be annotated with all these footnotes and stuff for the time being. So that when we take this, once you guys kind of give me the thumbs up, we will be scheduling like a public meeting to go over everything with people before adoption. And we will put this all out here with all these notes. But then I'm going to have to do a clean public hearing draft where all the footnotes disappear, all the cross-references are filled in, and all the references to the previous code go away. And so essentially it becomes what will be your new planning and zoning code. And that is when we will initiate the adoption through the planning commission. So I will work with the mayor and Joshua and Marvin to kind of finalize some of these legal things, but what I'd like to try to do is maybe in your May meeting is I will come up here, we'll go over through everything. You know, see if you have any final changes or suggestions based on the red line visions. And then we'll see if we could try to schedule a public meeting shortly thereafter, because what we can try to do is get this on the June agenda, the June MPC, or the Planning Commission's agenda for their review before sending it to council. So we'll schedule out the adoption from there. Yes,
Question on penalty,
yes.
the other big one. I kinda like our penalty now for zoning, but I'd like to see it go to escalating.
Oh, yeah.
Uh,
Did I share with you an example of an escalating?
Well, no, but I know we just enacted a vacant property registry that has a
Mhm.
nice escalating one. And I'm gonna tell you why. We've got, right now, it's a $500 civil fine if you violate the zoning code.
Yeah.
Except for building without a permit or not getting a certificate of zoning compliance. Those are knocked down clear to a 50. And I don't like that. I'm gonna give you an example. Last year, we got railroaded by a well-known contractor in this area who built an addition on their commercial property within a setback. It was encroaching. So we told them to stop building on Friday. Monday, building's finished. And he tells me that we can't do anything to him, basically. We worked that out, but the penalty being $50 a day, it doesn't scare anybody off. And I like, the vacant property has an escalation of, the first one's a civil fine, second one moves up to a double civil fine, and then it escalates finally either to a $1,000 fine or you got a misdemeanor criminal charge. And I like having both as an option, because some people will respond better if they've got to go to court, and others if you dig into their pocketbook.
Well, and the other one that I can send you is an escalated fine for repeat offenders. So for things that are not like the construction of a building, like signs or something like that, if they keep, like,
Yes,
if they do it and you put them in violation and they, oh, okay, I'll pull it out, and then they do it again, that you can hit them with escalating, like the repeat offender.
I'm trying to do that when we redo the property maintenance code too, because that's where I really see that comes.
I will send you a draft, because I actually based one for a code off of one that's from property maintenance. I'll send you an example.
Have you ever written property maintenance code? Have you?
Have I written one? No,
Yeah.
I have not written one, but I've worked on.
That's
So the real question is, would you like to work on?
we do.
You missed that.
I have more and more, they're just adopting the International Property Maintenance Code with some variations on it, but.
Because right now.
All right, well, we have a light at the end of the tunnel, I think.
Yeah, we do.
Excellent.
Excellent.
We'll see you in May.
Yep.
You'll get a zoning map and.
No, we
Yep.
got other-
Got